Welcome to Founder Unfiltered. I'm Bradley Jacobs, the founder of Mylands, and your host today. This show is about the hard stuff founders don't usually talk about, but they're all thinking. Today's guest bootstrapped his company for 13 years before raising $180 million. It's not a typo. He is the co founder and CEO of Muckrack, the leading PR software platform, and the Shorty Awards, which honor the best of social media. He got his start building websites as a teenager in Long Island, worked at CNN, launched the first founder podcast in 2005, and has been quietly building one of the most interesting bootstrap to scale stories in tech. Greg Galant, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on,
I'm
Brett.
really excited to chat with you. And I want to start really by if you could think about what's made you successful, like the single biggest factor of your success as an entrepreneur, what would you say?
Say persistence more than anything else is just so huge because I've had lots of business ideas that didn't work out as more than even what's in the bio, and then also even the ones that did, and especially the one that's scaled the biggest took a long time to get traction and get to scale. So I think it's just like being willing to stick with things and stick at it and bounce back from a failure.
We've talked about this on the show where there's a time to stick with something, a certain business or product, and then there's certainly a time to pivot away. So you've had now successfully scaled a business, but you said there were lots of failures along the way, yet persistence is like the biggest quality. So how do you know when to be persistent with the same idea or whether it's time to slightly iterate or kind of scrap it altogether?
I think people don't talk about it enough. Like I think the hardest part of entrepreneurship, because you hear those stories where like someone, they're sticking with this not working and they just kept going, and then eventually it does work, and there's lots of cases of the opposite. I can tell you, like, in my career, maybe the one I stuck with the longest that didn't work was before I started these companies. Podcasting wasn't even a word in 2005, but it just was just picking up. And then I think it was a year later that Apple integrated podcasting. I also tried launching a podcast ad network. And we built the first ever system where we could dynamically insert ads into podcasts and track how many downloads every podcast had. And man, I spent like 2 years banging my head against the wall trying to make that business work, getting meetings with everybody that I could. I did get a couple customers. That's like the hard part is like at like Business Week as a customer and the street.com, and we ran some ads for Focus Film. So it wasn't like there was zero traction, but there wasn't enough. And I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, I now know that it took 10 years longer before that market worked. Like, people launched successful podcast ad servers and ad networks, but none of them worked until 10 years later, 2015. And I couldn't have afforded to spend a decade of my life not making any money. But you don't know that at the time. And there were also like, there was another company that we were competing with that got funded by both Sequoia and Kleiner Perkins. They were the first company since Google to get that. So it's like, just imagine I'm sitting there. I'm like, on one hand, it's like, well, Google and, Kleiner and Sequoia are betting on the space I'm in. I've got a few customers, so it's not hopeless, but also like it was really hard to get any customers to buy. And that's where, retrospect, I wish I could have made that decision in 6 months. Took me 2 years, but even so, I could have easily justified spending another 2 years on it. And I think you just have to feel like that inertia. And then I can tell you the opposite story with businesses that have worked in a moment, but maybe I'll start with that one because it's like some of it I'd say, like, do you feel like you're pushing the boulder totally up the hill in that like nobody wants what you're doing? Or is there any feeling of like, hey, the market's pulling you, the market really needs this, and you're struggling to keep up? It's still hard work, but that pull from the market. So maybe that's the best way I can sum it up is like, is it like you're totally rolling the boulder up the mountain, or, do you feel like you're starting to get to the point where where people want
And
it.
is that because we talk about market pull all the time, and right there's the kind of age old saying of a even a mediocre team in an amazing market still wins, but right an amazing team in a mediocre market doesn't. Right? Like, would you agree with
Yeah.
that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And, it really struck me when I finally did hit on something that really worked. And that was first I launched the Shorty Awards and then Muckrack soon after. With each one of them, I'm like, man, I'm working just as hard as I did on the podcast ad network, but people actually want to sign the contracts. Like people are way faster to take the meeting. I'm like, same idiot doing both businesses. But one of them, it's working. It's like the market wanted it. There was some degree, I think, where I learned doing the first business. I got tactically better at how to close a deal and sign a contract. But the biggest difference was just the market wanted what I had. And the hard part is you're doing your first business. Like that was really, I mean, I started my business in high school doing web development, but the podcast ad network was kind of my first product based business. If you don't have anything to compare it to, it's like, oh, I guess it's just this hard. But now in retrospect, I can see it wasn't that it was that hard. It was that the market didn't want what I had. Like I was working the right amount. I was getting the word out enough. It's just there wasn't that product market fit in as visceral a way as there needed to be.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And what I'm hearing you say is that there's an element of not a whole lot within you or your tactics changed. Like, yes, you learned some lessons, but at the end of the day, it was down to the market and what was the big difference between what worked and what didn't.
Yeah, exactly. I always like to think of the analogy of like Edison with coming up with the right filament for a light bulb, where it wasn't like he was a genius in that like he just knew what the right filament was. He was just willing to try 100 different filaments, and then one of them worked. And so it's like he could have, sat around and been like debated which would be the perfect filament, or he could have just tried a bunch. I think there's some degree with entrepreneurship, unfortunately, where it's like that, and that you have your ideas and you take them to the market, but there's this unknowable element of it, kind of like a filament. Hopefully, you don't have to try 100 times, but there's this unknowable element. Like, does the market really need it? Is it the right time? And also, you're always coming up with the idea. It's going to take you a few months or maybe in a couple of years to build the thing and get it in front of customers and see if people are going to write a check for it and then renew. And over that time, there might be other competitors that enter, new technologies that develop, or the market changes. So there's this element where I think, an unknowable element that you have to go out there and test the
Yeah.
idea. That's why I always encourage people to try to like give themselves some now I guess the cool word is longevity, but kind of the entrepreneurial longevity, and that like, are you setting yourself up so you could try a few different things and fail if needed? Because if you have to make it all work in just a few months, and you only get one shot, there's a decent chance that shot's not going to
Right. It's
work.
like you could do all the user research in the world, but until you get an actual product out there with pricing and all those kinds of things, you really just you don't know.
100%. Yeah, you don't know, and then also you don't even know how the market's going to evolve. Like when we launched the Shorty Awards, between when we launched it, and it was the first award ever to honor social media at the time. Twitter was the only social network that was open to people other than your friends. We launched the Shorty Awards. Within the next 2 months, like first in 24 hours, we went viral. So we went from nothing to the top trending term on Twitter. So like the opposite of my last experience. We're like, within 24 hours, everybody wanted to talk to us and knew who we were. But over that time, also, Twitter tripled in size. And everybody thought back then in 2009, Twitter was the popular narrative was it's a fad, 140 characters, it's going to go away any day now. So, we launched it. It could have been that maybe could have been the peak to Twitter, but it turned out that was just the beginning of a huge growth spurt, and we got to ride along with that. So there is that element of kind of, you know, having to exist with all these unknowable factors outside your control.
I want to talk about mindset because what we're talking about is pretty tactical, right? You try an idea and it either works or it doesn't work. And then you maybe shift if you feel like you're pushing the boulder uphill. But the whole time, you might be questioning, am I good at this? Am I going to make it? I feel like an imposter. I'm going to be judged. What does failure mean for my family? There's so many questions that go along with this that we struggle with. So I'm curious from your perspective and your experience, what mindset supported you in having things not work and then having things work? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and the biggest struggle probably day to day. I feel like the tension or the hard thing to reconcile and get right is that on one hand, I'll put my all into it because it's kind of a point of personal pride to make it work and I care about it, and it wraps up completely in my identity. But then on the flip side, it's keeping in mind what's not in my control, which is most things, unfortunately. That's particularly what's hard about having to deal with those pivot questions because it's kind of like, okay, well, I wrapped myself up in this one business and now it doesn't work. And, I have to not just pivot the business, but like tear down my identity because I'd spent, in that case, 2 years being like, I'm the foremost expert on podcast advertising. And, I'm on a mission from God to tell everybody that podcast advertising is the best thing in the world, and then to say, oh wait, no, I'm going to pivot from that. You can't not take that personally, and it's hard. I don't have the perfect answer to it, except I think as much as possible, like trying to separate out what's in your control from what's outside of your control and being conscious about that. Trying as much as I can to like keep the mental framework of like, hey, this is a science experiment that I'm running, kind of like that Edison example where I'm like, I'm trying the filament. It's like I'm making a good decision to try this filament, but I'm not going to take it personally if this filament doesn't work. I'm just going to move on to the next filament. One kind of hack I've learned along the way and have employed many times when having to make a big decision, start a new business, stop a new business, or even with, I've been on this 15-year scale journey, but within within this one business, there were lots of kind of gut wrenching decisions to make. Do we be self serve? Do we hire salespeople? Do we make this acquisition? Do we move into this next market? Et cetera, et cetera. And so one thing I would always do is I'd write up like a long memo. And whenever I'd start writing them, the intent is like it's just for myself. And I do that because I want to be able to look back and be like, hey, you know what? If this decision works, it'll be great to go back and read that. But if it doesn't work, then I can go back and be like, at least I wasn't an idiot. And I can go back and know, kind of like pulling up an abstract for a scientific paper, a scientific experiment or something, like this was like a smart decision that I made. And, maybe every time you make a smart entrepreneurial decision, it has a 25% chance of working. So you can make 5 or 10 of them, you'll have a great success in your life. But, each time you can go back and see like, hey, is it that I made, that I missed something in my decision framework, or that I made a good decision and I just got unlucky with how things panned out in the market. And then whenever I do that, actually, at least now that, within the context of this company, I'm always like, you know what, I wrote this up. Why don't I share it with first my co-founder, then with my team? And then most of the time I usually just ended up sharing it with the whole company. I'm like, here's what we're doing and here's my decision maker framework for it. And by the way, like spot hole, like I give them, I share this Google Doc with comments on, like, let me know what I'm missing. But I've just always found that's been like at least a good hack to try to kind of separate out like taking everything personally, but yet still really caring it, but recognizing that like you're making experiments in the marketplace and it's not fully in your control.
What I'm hearing that's powerful is I am not the dictator of whether things work, right? The market is. So I'm taking a bet. I'm going to put a horse in the race, and the market's either going to take it forward or not. But it's not about me necessarily. And as you said, like, how do I not take this personally when something doesn't work out? Because that's when we get really down on ourselves and we start with the self doubt and the questions. Am I going to be able to figure this out? And all of those, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's one of those things where like, hey, it always sounds easy and I can give this as advice, but like I still struggle with it because like when you're working on the thing all day and you love what you do and you care, like every human instinct is to want to take it personally, and you have to fight that and balance it. So I think that's as much of the struggle as anything else in business. In fact, maybe now with AI, like it used to be, on podcasts, I could like give someone some really tactical piece of advice, how to set up your sales team. Now you can just ask Claude and it can tell you that. So it's like the only thing that, or, might be the most important thing, and that you can now get the tactical knowledge very easily, which was not the case 15 years ago, back when there was very little on the web about it and the books were all pretty out of date. But yeah, it's, I think that mindset that helps you make good decisions and persevere is maybe the most
Yeah,
important
and
thing.
that's worth double clicking on, right? Because as you just said, the tactics are completely democratized across everybody, right? In one prompt, I can find out the best world class way to set up a sales team in your example. And so the differentiators are different than they used to be now. And it's like flipped overnight.
Yeah, it's well said. It's just wild to watch it happen. I mean, the reason I started my podcast in 2005, like when I started my business in high school and I kept it up throughout college, I couldn't find anything on the web. I mean, there were maybe like two blogs by VCs, no blogs by entrepreneurs. Twitter didn't exist, all these places people go now to find these things. You didn't have great blogs like SaaStr and things like that yet. So it's like some old dusty book on entrepreneurship. And I'd read Inc. magazine, but it would always be like a 500-word article about someone who started a company and scaled it, and it'd be like one line on how they did it. I'd be like, wait, there's got to be a lot more stuff in between. And yeah, it was like back then, just knowing, like, I remember when we were hiring our first salespeople, just to figure out like, how should the commission plan work? There's maybe like one or two blog posts on the whole internet about how a commission plan for a software salesperson should work, and kind of had to make it up. And that's why I think it used to be that the people who were in Silicon Valley, which I never was, had such an advantage, just because like, their friend's dad from high school had done a business, and they could just tell them how to write the commission plan thing. And these super tactical things were locked up, and now it's all out there, which should be super exciting to anybody in, especially anyone from a background that didn't give them the inside track.
So, if the differentiator now, one of the things we said is mindset, maybe the most important. What else are the differentiators if the tactics are democratized?
I think mindset's one. I feel like another big one, I guess it's a part of mindset, but it's just courage. It's like actually being willing to try it, because that's one thing AI doesn't have, at least not yet, in the sense that, like, I mean, it's so funny when I'm chatting with Claude or ChatGPT. It's always like, well, here's what I would do. It's like, well, you're not going to do it because you're not a person. You're just an AI stringing together words to me. And the other thing is AI, it's maybe courage and judgment, which are two sides of the same coin. And because you can get AI to say anything, AI can be like, oh, yeah, you should totally hire three salespeople right now. It seems like you have traction. And you're like, well, can you argue the other side? It'll give you a reason why not. And then a lot of times after that, you say, okay, now that you've argued both sides, which side do you think is right? And it'll go with the side that it didn't initially give you. And then you ask a different model on a different day, it'll give you a
Right.
different
Right.
different call. So it's like, it's going to give you these smattering of options and maybe save you the work of having to ask someone, to just use this mundane example, like how do you set up a commission plan for a salesperson? Like that's legitimately used to be like you got to spend an hour having somebody walk you through it, and it's hard to get that person on the phone. Now, like AI gives you that, but then it's like actually having the conviction and the courage to be like, I'm actually going to hire three salespeople and pay them this cash, is something that different people are going to do very differently. And there are a lot of people out there who are addicted to the paycheck. I once read this great book by Felix Dennis, who created the Week magazine and Maxim magazine, and self-made billionaire publisher out of the UK. And he has this line where he says, a paycheck is more addictive than crack cocaine. And then he's like, and I would know because I was addicted to crack cocaine for 10 years. And he tells these wild stories. But I think his point is powerful where I see so many people out there, they get a job, they get the paycheck, they up their lifestyle. So they're spending their whole paycheck and sometimes more. They get the raise, they spend that money, and they're just on this path where they can never get onto that entrepreneurial journey to be taking the risks and then be willing to go long enough the amount of time it could take to be an entrepreneur, which could be several years before you get your first success or even longer. And so they kind of cut themselves off from that creative entrepreneurial life, and they don't get it. And to do that, I think it takes courage.
Mistakes. We all make them. Every entrepreneur has made their fair share of mistakes. And I know you obviously have a lot of success with the scaled business now. What were some of the biggest mistakes that you made as a founder? And if they actually cost you, what did they cost you?
Yeah, well, I don't know how long we have in this podcast because I could fill up hours and hours with mistakes. Let's see, and to kind of separate out, like, I'm trying to think of how to separate out, like, there are businesses that didn't work, where again, it's hard to say they were a mistake. I mean, of course, I had a crystal ball. I wish I hadn't done them, like the podcast ad network. But I think, maybe within that, I'd say the mistake was to not pivot from that sooner and not try something else sooner. I also kind of doubled down. We built a whole lot of tech to dynamically insert ads into podcasts. So I was enamored with this technical challenge, which now is a very common thing. At the time, like, we were literally the first to build that tech. I thought the tech was so cool. But in retrospect, I feel like my mistake, even given what I could have known at the time, was like to not focus on just selling the ads. And then the second order effect is like, hey, we sell so many ads that we now need technology to insert the ads. That would have been awesome. But why, my advice to my younger self, why build the tech to scale selling ads until you've proven you can sell a ton of ads and that there's a lot of demand for those ads? So I think that's one mistake, jumping to the tech before proving out the business with it. I'd say another mistake too is not doubling down enough when I have traction. So I have like a few examples. Like I started that podcast on my own before, and then I was running it during the podcast ad network. But the podcast actually had some good traction back then. Like, I had the founder of LinkedIn on back when LinkedIn was 50 employees, the founder of Yelp, Vanguard Group, and I had a few thousand listeners, which was a lot of people given how few people listened to podcasts back then. So I had something. So I could have done, I probably should have just doubled down on my own podcast and not tried the podcast ad network, even though, podcast ad network was a sexier thing that could hypothetically scale more. And I've done, I've made that mistake a few times. Like when we launched Muckrack originally, which is the business that I run now that's way scaled. It was originally a 2-week project, and it was the first ever site where you could just find all the journalists and we gave them all profiles on the web. And so we launched that originally as a free website. And then we're like, well, that worked pretty well. Let's launch more sites similar to Muckrack, but aimed at different verticals. So we launched one called Venture Maven that was like the same thing for VCs. We launched one for pets that were online, people with, social media accounts for their pets, which was like right at the dawn of that, which turned out to be a pretty big trend eventually too. And we launched like a dozen websites like this, and we kept launching new stuff. And then it wasn't until we kind of got to a point where we felt like a little stuck, and we bootstrapped. We raised like 200K in angel. That was the only primary capital we raised in the company till the 180 million. But a couple of my angels, and I was pissing them at the time for it, but in retrospect, they were right. They were like, Greg, you're just like too unfocused. Like, you've had some things that are working here, and just keep moving on to the next one. And I was finally, as stubborn as I was like, you know what, maybe they have a point. And I looked at everything that we built, and I saw that Muckrack really had the most traction because, like, we had all these journalists using it. And then being in New York at the time, I kept bumping into all these PR people. and they would tell me like, "Oh, I'm using your site to figure out who to pitch." Like, "Oh, wait a minute, like we have this whole profession of people using our website. They know who we are. They're using our data. We haven't built anything for them and we're not charging them." So that's where we're like, okay, let's double down here and actually build. Back then, it wasn't even called SaaS, but we're like, we'll just build a subscription product for them. They can pay us and use it, and we did that, and then that was the beginning of what's now a 400 person plus business. So it's that kind of not just knowing when to quit, but I think I'd say, my biggest mistake, it's also not knowing when to double down on something that wasn't my primary focus.
I love to double click on that because I think that's fascinating. And I'm curious what shifted within you so that you were able to double down and really increase that focus versus where in the past, like you kind of moved off from the podcast that was working and you moved away from or built, other kinds of sites from what was working. Like what needed to change?
Money. We were like, okay, let's focus on this, and we were always in search of a like scalable revenue model, because with the Shorty Awards, that was profitable from the first year we did it, and it's still going. We spun it off to its own business, and it's still profitable today. But it happens once a year, so there's kind of like a limit to how big it can be. And then it only happened once a year, so it's just gut wrenching to have to spend the whole year to wait to see how much money we'd make. So with Muckrack, when we relaunched it so we launched a free site in 2009, didn't focus on it, and then in 2011, towards the back half of 2011, we're like, okay, let's rebuild this thing and launch it as a business tool that we charge for to the PR community. And we kept it free for journalists. And so we launched it like that first, in the first month, we got an $8,000 MRR, like roughly like $8,000 a month coming in from people who'd signed up for this subscription. And that was like enough where it's like, okay, well, it's not enough to live off of, but it's decent money. And hey, if we could double it or triple it, it could be a lot. In those early days, we were kind of thinking like, well, hey, if we could make like 20,000 a month from this, that'd be pretty cool. Then we could use that to fund all these other business ideas we have and all that. So we didn't even decide back then to give it that much focus, just to give it some more focus. But the thing is, once we had customers and that revenue, and again, what I was talking about with that market pull, like it kept pulling from us where it's like, well, more people want to sign up. They asked us to build more, and we had more ideas for what we could build for them. And so that's really what did it, was just like, okay, well, let's see if we can double it. Then we double it. Let's see if we can double it again. And what if we built these 5 features? Could we then triple it? So it's just that kind of continual mind to keep like, let's keep making this thing bigger. It kind of happened gradually. There was never like one moment where like, okay, we're trying a bunch of things. Never like one moment where, oh, this is it. We just did our analysis. It was just like kept getting bigger. And then some point in the rearview mirror, it's like, oh wait, this thing's doing like a few million, over the course of a few years. Like, this thing's doing real money. Like, obviously, we're going to put our effort into making it even bigger.
I know you're people first and you're also really big on remote work. So I'm curious how remote work has worked out for you. How do you make it work for the company? Obviously, 400 plus people is a lot to manage remotely. So I'm curious, and what you mean by people first. Like, what does that actually look like? A lot of companies be like, oh, we have snacks and a ping pong table. Like, what does it really mean in your eyes?
Yeah, great question. So we were really early adopters for remote work, partially because we were bootstrapping and we just couldn't afford to hire everybody in New York or get a nice office. Part of it too, my co-founder Lee Semmel, who's the CTO, just always liked working from home a good portion of the week so we could focus on coding. So from the very start, we were remote first, which again, it's one of those things where it sounds like even if you don't agree with it, like an obvious
Mhm.
option now, but in 2009, 2011, it was just like an insane concept, that someone's going to be remote. We did have an office, but only half. at any given point, we never had more than half the company living anywhere near us in New York. So half the company worked from home every day. And then the half the company that was in the New York area, we never made them come in. We felt like, well, some people can be remote all the time. Why would we make you come in just because you happen to live near the office? So we had some people who choose to come in every day. We also had some people who came in like once a month, or once a week, or we had one guy, our head of product in the early days. He lived 10 minutes from the office, but he just never come in when it was raining, because he didn't want to have to walk through the rain, for 10 minutes in New York City. So it was very much like everyone just choose when they wake up. If they come in, maybe they work from home in the morning, come in the afternoon. The only time like a good chunk of the people would come in is if we had like a free lunch for someone's birthday, and then people would come in for the free lunch. So we were always this like remote first company. I remember though, whenever like partners or customers would come to our office and they saw a bunch of desks empty, they'd be
Mm.
like, "Are you guys okay? Like, are you going out of business?" And then, no, things are great. People are just working from home. Like, home, like, how do you know if they're really working? And my retort was always like, well, how do you know someone's working
Right.
in the office? Like, just because they're sitting at the computer, you don't know what they're doing. So we'd always were remote first. And then during the pandemic, of course, we had to shut down the New York office. Then our lease was up in 2022. And by then we'd actually grew a lot during the pandemic. A lot of the new people we hired weren't in the New York area, and I'd moved down to Miami. So only a third of the team was still in New York. And when we surveyed the New Yorkers, and they were all like, "Yeah, maybe I'd come in once a week at most," but nobody wanted to come in more than once a week. So like, okay, well, how about we just like give you money for a bar tab to do some meetups? Do you want to see each other once a week? And everybody was like, sure. So we decided, okay, we won't renew the lease, and went all in on remote. And I mean, since we made that decision, we've quadrupled in size. So it's definitely working. To your point, though, about culture, I think there's something clarifying about remote work, in that people fool themselves a lot of ways when they have an office. They, like you said, they get the ping pong table and like, that's our culture. We're fun and innovative. Look at the ping pong table. Or they're like, hey, everyone's staying till 7 every night, so we're all working hard. And but it kind of hides like, well, now if you're remote, you don't have the ping pong table, so you really have to look at the culture as being like the actions that everybody on your team is taking. And you also can't look who's arriving early and staying late at the office to know who's a hard worker. So you actually have to find ways to measure
Mm.
the outputs of people on your
Yeah.
team, and be a lot more thoughtful, which is what you should do even if you have an office. But it just takes the mask away. So I found remote work to be very clarifying in that sense, and very productive in terms of keeping that discipline.
So how do you measure, as you say, you're trying to figure out who are your top performers, who are really nailing their output? How do you measure that with remote work?
Yeah, well, it's the exact same way you should do it in an office. It's all about identifying like the input and the output metrics for everybody. For a long time, I've been obsessed with the book High Output Management by Andy Grove, who's the former CEO of Intel and was one of their founding employees. And he writes it all back then. He even writes in the book like, there's some new innovations coming out, like email, that I think will change how business works, because it was written in the 80s. But that idea of like measuring, figuring out like what are the output metrics that matter, and then which inputs are people focused on. So, for example, in sales, like the obvious one is like, okay, well, are they hitting their quota? Are they selling what they should be selling? And if they are, awesome. And I always see these people at the offices, they're like, oh, this salesperson, they're bad for our culture. They're leaving at 4 o'clock to pick up their kid. It's like, but are they hitting quota? Oh yeah, she's crushing quota. So it's like, so why do you care? Like, you might have someone else who's working 10 hours a day, staying at the office and not hitting their quota. So you don't know that. But then beyond that, you want to also look at all the input metrics. So it's like, okay, are they hitting the quota? That's a lagging indicator. But what are all their leading indicators? How many emails are they sending a day? How many demos are they doing? Are they doing the demos well? Are you listening to the demos and what now you can watch the recordings of the demos and see how good they're doing at that. Are they following up quickly? Are they asking for the order? So through all these metrics you can identify to lead that up. And for most positions you can figure that out, looking at if someone's a programmer, what, not just how much code are they producing, but what's the quality of it, what's the frequency of how quickly they can ship, etc. You can look at various input metrics in terms of what tools they're using and what they're working on to measure that, and then onward, and then you just have to figure out how to drive it down to in the organization, so everyone knows what to expect from their teams, and you can create that culture. And I think really equally importantly at an office, but it's essential with remote, and just so clarifying on what you have to do there.
Last question, then we get to wrap up. What would you tell your younger self if you could go back and give that version of you some advice, some encouragement? What would you say?
Maybe take it all a little less personally, like back to what we were talking about. As much as I can say, like I did have that mental model back then about like, okay, this is experiments. I'm running a good try here. The market's not working out. But I do have to, I have to admit, it did hurt my ego. Like I would have felt a lot better if that first
Yeah.
business worked. And I stuck with it. But I think if I had a little more bravado and didn't let it get me down, even to the degree that I did, I could have just enjoyed that time more. So I'd say that's like the biggest thing. Where if I could get that time machine and just impart one piece of wisdom, I'd whisper that into my
Yeah.
ear.
Amazing. If people want to find you, where's the best place to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to reach. There's my personal website, Galant, GALANT.org. I'm on both Twitter and Instagram. I just have at Gregory on there. I signed up early enough to get my first name. And then on LinkedIn, I think it's just my last name is the username, but you can search me there pretty easily
Awesome.
too.
And we'll link all those in the show notes so people can easily find you. Greg, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, insights. Really appreciate it. Learned a lot from you today.
My pleasure. I had a blast too. Great conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.